This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it is Saturday, and that means it's time for another video in my history of the banned and restricted list. Part 1 of this series began way back in 1994, when the banned and restricted list was born, so we've come a long way to get to part 25, which looks at 2018. In our last video, we saw that 2017 was the first time in several years that cards had to be banned out of Standard, with a total of 5 cards being banned in that format that year. In general, 2017 was pretty rough, with cards having to be banned or restricted in multiple other formats too. 2018 was better in terms of raw numbers. Only 4 cards were banned or restricted for the first time during that year. However, all 4 of them were in Standard. So that means Wizards had back-to-back years of having to ban cards in Standard for the first time since 2004 and 2005. And that's not a good place to be. In this video, we're going to look at those 4 cards. All 4 of the Standard cards to get the axe were banned in the January 2018 announcement. Those cards were Attune with Aether, Rogue Refiner, Rampaging Ferocidon, and Ramunap Ruins. These bannings really took aim at 2 decks running amok in Standard, Energy and Ramunap Red, a variant of Red Deck Wins. These 2 decks were the best decks in Standard by a wide margin, making up more than 40% of the metagame combined, so these bans were made to make the format a little less homogeneous. Let's start first by looking at Attune with Aether and Rogue Refiner. Both of these cards made energy decks way too good. We saw in 2017 that Wizards banned Aetherworks Marvel out of Standard. This was because it was too easy to produce energy and use the Marvel to power out crazy powerful creatures in the early game. While banning the Marvel was certainly necessary, it didn't do enough to rein in energy decks. The new mechanic was just too good for Standard. So, in January 2018, Wizards had to ban some more energy cards, or the deck would continue to be way too good. In the end, they settled on Attune with Aether and Rogue Refiner. On the face of it, these 2 cards may not seem that imposing. These decks were loaded up with ways to make energy, and it was possible to run 4 or 5 color energy decks, and that was thanks in large part to Attune with Aether, which provides you with energy and helps you fix your mana. That turned out to be way too much value for 1 mana in these decks, and banning Attune with Aether also meant energy decks would have worse mana. Up until this point, energy decks had such good mana that you basically just crammed all the best energy cards into your deck, and you had something that was highly competitive. The banning of Attune helped weaken energy decks by taking away important fixing, and an important source of energy in the early game. So, Rogue Refiner is powerful in a more obvious way. A 3-mana 3/2 that drew you a card when it enters the battlefield would probably see play in most formats already, at least most Standard formats. It's just always going to be a 2-for-1, and that also goes a long way towards helping you win a game. But Rogue Refiner goes one better than that, also giving your deck energy to be used by most of the other cards in your deck, in addition to drawing you a card. This often amounted to 3 full cards worth of value instead of just 2. Rogue Refiner was a big part of what made energy decks so oppressive, and as a result, it had to be banned. The big problem here was that Wizards underestimated just how powerful adding incidental energy to cards would be. These 2 cards were both costed about 1 mana lower than they probably should have been, because it seems like R&D sort of felt like just tacking energy onto cards would be a fine thing to do, without realizing just how good energy would be. In the end, both of these cards stayed banned in Standard for the remaining time they would have been legal there. Overall, the banning of these 2 cards was successful, as energy decks were severely weakened and would never be the force in Standard that they had been before the bans. The other 2 cards banned out of Standard in January 2018 were Rampaging Ferocidon and Ramunap Ruins. In addition to energy decks, the other deck that was really dominating Standard was Ramunap Red, and after the banning of energy, the deck probably would have gotten even stronger, because the only decks it didn't have a positive win percentage against were some of the energy variants. These decks were mostly not anything new. Mono-red aggro decks have been a thing in Magic almost since the game was born, and that's what these were. However, these 2 cards helped make the deck not just the premier aggro deck in the format, but they also helped make Ramunap Red so powerful that it made up a part of the metagame roughly equal to energy decks. So let's start with the Ferocidon. This is the kind of card a red deck loves. A 3-mana 3/3 with Menace that will damage your opponent over the course of the game with an ability and just because it's an evasive attacker, while also preventing your opponent from gaining life. Mono red aggro decks have been a thing for a long time, but two of the main ways to combat them are either with gaining life or flooding the board with creature tokens who can fend off the opponent's small creatures in the early game. Mono red decks might be fast, but they can generally only do finite amounts of damage before running out of gas, and life gain and creature tokens make it so that you can get out of range and weather the storm to make the game go late, at which point you'll probably win. So, Ferocidon gives these decks a highly efficient creature that completely negated the primary strategies that had historically worked against aggressive red decks, and for that reason it had to be banned. By banning it, decks could now more effectively combat the red aggro decks in the format going forward. Rampaging Ferocidon did not remain banned in Standard forever. It actually got unbanned about a month before it rotated out of Standard, in what was one of the stranger decisions to unban a card in the history of the game, simply because it had no real impact so close to rotation. Now let's look at Ramunap Ruins, the other card that got banned to weaken these red aggro decks. As I mentioned, this variant of red deck wins was called Ramunap Red, and that's because this desert played a big role in the deck. As I mentioned a moment ago, red decks often have the problem of running out of gas and not being able to finish off opponents if games go long. For that reason, having various ways to do those last few points of damage can be great, and the Ruins gives you exactly that. Because it sacrificed deserts to do the damage, it was a potentially repeatable effect. This also meant that another weakness of red decks was somewhat mitigated. Mana flood can be a real problem in this type of deck, but in the Ruins, you have a powerful mana sink that can cash in those extra lands for damage. It gives red decks a late game that they have no business in having, so it got banned. Like the bannings to weaken energy decks, the banning of Ferocidon and Ramunap Ruins were largely successful. In both cases, the decks that were weakened didn't completely cease to exist, but making them less effective made it so that the format was much more balanced, and that's largely why the remainder of 2018 was quiet. Next time we'll begin looking at 2019, a year that was anything but quiet. I say begin because it was an incredibly active year for the banned and restricted list. So active that it had to be broken into multiple videos. Between the printing of lots of new cards that messed up multiple formats and the creation of a new format, Pioneer, that had its own banned and restricted list, there were lots of cards to get the axe that year that we need to talk about. Next time we'll be looking at 2019 up through August. Well, that does it for this episode of the History of the Banned and Restricted List. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe, and if you need to catch up on this series, or on my MTG Top 10s, you should see the playlist for both of those series on your screen now. Thanks for watching.